Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria, and that's right, I'm back again in my 15th century get-up, and there's a very good reason for that, and that's because I'm here talking about a video which I'm sure pretty much everyone who follows my channel has probably already seen, by the fantastic Todd of Todd Stuff, Todd's Workshop, Todd Cutler, and that is the video where he got together a panel of experts and tested armour, specifically a late 14th, early 15th century breastplate of the Coburg type, against longbows, against warbows of the time. Now, I have to start off by saying that obviously, so I knew about this test before it happened. I'd heard rumour of it, partly also because I know all but one of the people involved in the testing. So Will Sherman made this bow. I know Will, he comes to one of the events I run every year. Great guy, great maker of bows and arrows, good archer in his own right, and clearly an expert, I mean one of the leading experts on the Mary Rose bows and arrows and all of the surviving English archery equipment that really still survives. Kevin Legg of Plessis Armories, he actually made my harness, which I don't feature on this channel very much, it has to be said, but I've known him for years as well. And obviously Todd has been on my channel, Dr. Capwell, Tobias Capwell, Toby Capwell, he's a buddy of mine as well, and he's also been on my channel quite a bit. Joe Gibbs, I know by reputation, is a phenomenal bowman and of legendary status, and I don't know him personally, but clearly he was a fantastic choice for the job. And the first thing we have to say is that this whole experiment, should we call it, let's call it an experiment for this video, because that's what it was. This whole experiment was without a shadow of a doubt in my mind, and I think most people who are interested in this subject as well, was pretty much the best testing of a 15th century or kind of Agincourt period breastplate against period equipment, period archery equipment that has ever been done. Now, there have been lots of other tests done over the years. There have been problems with either the armour, there have been problems with the bow or with the arrows, or the way that the armour was set up, the way that the test was set up. In some cases, people haven't even used bows. They've actually shot them out of air cannons and this kind of stuff. This was, for all of the reasons that you can possibly think of, I think this was the best test that has been done so far. However, I also want to be clear about one thing at the very beginning of this video. What I intend to talk about here is how did this military equipment that was so important in the 14th and 15th centuries, particularly in England, but also in France and other places as well, Spain, how did this work given what we see in this test? You see, the problem is that these tests are always framed as arrow or bow versus armour, okay, longbow versus armour. But that's not what the test is. Let's actually be precise about this. This was a scientific experiment testing a bow of the period, an arrow of the period, against one breastplate of the period. Okay, breastplate does not an armour make. So a breastplate is one part of an armour, and it's one part of an armour for one specific type of combatant who was on the battlefield at that time. So what this is a test of is a test of the English warbow, or the English type warbow of that period, of a considerable power, 150-pound draw weight, thereabouts. And an arrow which is specially designed to go against opponents of that period, against a breastplate which is probably, coupled with the helmet, the most able to resist any sort of damage or being compromised of any part of the armour on any combatant on an early 15th century battlefield. Now, I don't want you to think that this is just, oh, this is Matt making apologies for the longbow. This is Matt making apologies of why the armour succeeded, why the armour won. It's not that. What I'm trying to point out is this isn't armour versus bow. This is breastplate, a very good quality breastplate, against bow. Okay, and that is a very specific thing, and as always, I always try to talk about context on this channel, as you well know, and the point is that this type of breastplate is only one element in the full scope of testing why did military archery, why was it so predominant in the 14th and 15th centuries and even into the 16th centuries? Why was it so predominant, so potent, and clearly had a lot invested in it? And one of the problems is whenever you get this kind of test, people always see it in black and white terms. They always want to conclude, oh, armour works 100%. It's complete. A person in armour is invulnerable to longbows. Or the archers want to say, armour's useless. It doesn't work at all. Arrows go straight through it. And as I have always tried to reiterate, if either of those things were true, then there wouldn't have been armour around, or there wouldn't have been longbows around. But there were both. People were expending vast amounts of energy, training, expense, investment, development in these weapons and in the armour of the time as well. There are very good reasons why people of wealth were spending huge amounts of money on the best armour that they could procure, of the best quality steel, in some cases hardened steel as well. Why did they do that? And why were the arrows developed with, in some cases, case hardened, in some cases hardened steel heads by law? Why did Henry V make such a big deal about specifying that arrows had to have hardened arrowheads if there wasn't a tussle going on, if there wasn't a challenge going on between the armours that people were developing and the weapons that people were developing to compromise them? And why were archers so massively employed and deployed? Why were they so hugely used and trained and invested in and paid? And why were bows so widely used, and why did their power increase and increase and increase if they weren't effective? But equally, same you can say for the armour. Why was it so heavily invested in if it wasn't effective? And the fact is that both are effective. So the real question that we come back to, and the reason why to a large extent the question of does an arrow penetrate a breastplate is irrelevant, is how do we explain how military archery worked in an era when armour was so capable against things like arrows? So I'm going to break this down. Why was military archery so effective in the 14th and 15th centuries? I'm going to break it down into 4 points. So number one, the first point is that the majority of people, the majority of soldiers on a battlefield weren't fully armoured knights. Surprise, surprise. So look at me, for example. I'm representing at the moment a relatively well-equipped and armoured archer of around the middle of the 15th century. I have a helmet, I have a brigandine, very often I'd have a mail shirt underneath this. Very occasionally I might have pieces of armour on my arms and legs. But as you can see, I've got lots of gaps. Even with my visor down, I am always going to have things exposed, and the reason is that I can't traipse around in full plate harness the whole time, because I'm not a man-at-arms, I'm not a knight, I don't have dozens of servants and people to look after me, to clean my armour, maintain my armour, help me dress in my armour, look after my multiple horses, and be all my retainers and everything else. The fact is that fully armoured, in other words head to toe, plated men-at-arms at the time of Agincourt or right the way through the 15th century, or indeed going further back into the 14th century, time of Cressy, Poitiers, all of these, or the Condottieri Wars in Italy in the late 14th century, the people who were wearing fully head-to-toe, fully encased harness were a minority. The majority of soldiers were people like me here. They were people who were required to do things like operate bows, or operate artillery, or carry pikes, or operate crossbows and things like this. So there were people predominantly either using pole weapons, using missile weapons, or operating artillery and doing kind of engineer type functions as well. And what would they have been wearing? Well, some of them would have just been wearing a gambeson. Some of them might not have been even wearing any armour at all. It's entirely possible that where people were sort of essentially press ganged and mass recruited, in some cases they would have had nothing. At best they may have just had a helmet of some type, a sort of skull cap type helmet, and a gambeson. If we look at the Battle of Towton, for example, there's some evidence that a lot of people were mass recruited for that. And there are other battles in the 100 Years' War, for example. We know that French armies accumulated local militias as they travelled and tried to engage the English army, who was on its chevauchée. They tried to engage the English army in battle, and so they accumulated followers who were there for that. Let's give the English a good old seeing, so you drive them out of the motherland. And quite simply, not everybody even would have had any armour, but even people like I'm representing here, so someone who might be a professional soldier. Yep, you know, I've got my sword, I've got my dagger, I've got my longbow in this case, I've got a helmet, I've got a brigandine, which in this case is made of hardened steel plates. This is going to provide some level of protection to missile weapons and, you know, hand weapons. But if people start unloading showers of longbow arrows at me, I'm in trouble, okay? I've got my arms, I've got my legs, I've potentially got my face open. The arrows may well go through this brigandine anyway, even if I have a mail shirt underneath. Even if we assume my hardened steel plates of my brigandine and the mail shirt, if I have it or not, and the arming jacket underneath do protect me on the torso from arrows, what about the rest of my body, okay? Do I feel confident enough in the armour that I'm wearing to say, you know, come on guys, shower arrows at me? No, I don't, okay? I absolutely do not want people, just to make this clear, I do not want people shooting lots of arrows at me, because I'm going to die pretty damn quickly, okay? And if you're doing the job of a typical soldier, I'm having to march either on foot, maybe I have a horse if I'm a mounted archer, but fundamentally I'm having to travel myself, I'm having to feed myself, I'm having to dress myself, I'm having to do everything for myself. I cannot afford full plate armour, and I couldn't even wear full plate armour and do the normal soldier jobs that I need to do as a soldier. So number one, the vast majority of people on a medieval battlefield were not fully armoured knights. So whether longbow arrows can penetrate the knight's armour or not, put that aside, because it can penetrate the kind of 7/10 of the rest of the armies, whatever they're wearing, or the bits where they don't have armour anyway. The second point is cavalry, horses, okay? It's really important to note that there are, at various points in history, there are certain things which nullify cavalry. Cavalry, never underestimate how powerful and potent cavalry is. There were periods of history where cavalry absolutely ruled the roost. But during the 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses, this kind of 14th, 15th century era, cavalry can be nullified to some extent by archery, okay? And that massively reduces the tactical options available to the side that don't have massed archery. So, for example, famously, you know, at the Crécy, Battle of Crécy, it does seem that lots of people attacked the English lines on horseback. And what did they get for their troubles? Well, of course, their horses got shot to pieces. We also know that this happened again at Agincourt. It should be noted, and I think lots of people misunderstand this, that at Agincourt, by that point, the French had predominantly learned the lesson that cavalry doesn't work well against archery. And for that reason, Marshal Boucicaut, who was in charge of the cavalry, or in charge of the overall battle plan at Agincourt, had intended to have a relatively small cavalry force of, I think, about 800 men divided into two different squadrons, and they were going to come up around the sides of the English army and attack the flanks, while the French army on foot, and remember, even at Poitiers in 1356, the French army had advanced on foot. The French army predominantly advanced on foot because they knew that their horses would get shot to pieces by English archers. So English archers by that point, even if there are no horses to shoot, are achieving a goal because they're nullifying the enemy's ability to deploy their cavalry as they would like to deploy them. So at Agincourt, Marshal Boucicaut had intended probably to, according to the Somme plan, had intended to flank around the English and attack the flanks. It's possible that some element of this is what eventually happened with the so-called attacking of the baggage train as featured in Shakespeare, whether that happened or not. But What we know that happened at Agincourt in the end was that because of the geographic lay of the land, the English army had put themselves, so they were protected on the flanks. And so the relatively small element of the French army that did attack on horseback went straight up the middle and probably the horses got shot to pieces. Falling off a horse is never pleasant, especially in armour, especially when people are shooting at you at the same time, especially in mud when your horse was slow moving, especially when you might find it difficult advancing further on foot in the mud in armour with limited visibility because you've got your visor down because people are shooting arrows at you. So life is difficult for a French person attacking the English army at Agincourt for many, many reasons. But therefore, English archery, or should we say archery in general, is excellent at nullifying cavalry, and not only at killing the horses but also therefore at making the cavalry far less effective. So there we've covered the two major headline points of why the longbow or warbow was so potent, was so effective in the 14th and 15th centuries. Number one, because most people you're shooting arrows at have exposed parts and not wearing full armour anyway, so armour penetration is not even an issue at this point. Secondly, the fact that you massively affect the enemy's ability to use cavalry. But now let's actually talk about shooting those armoured people, because we know that armoured people were shot, were wounded, including some very famous nobility, including Dukes of Burgundy, including Kings of Scotland. We know that people wearing full armour were wounded by arrows. So the question is, how? Well, the first thing to remind you is, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, what this excellent experiment was, and I'm not undermining at all the value of having done it, because I think it's kind of like we can stamp this now and say, yep, done and dusted, case closed. Does an arrow penetrate a breastplate? Almost never. Okay? Does it need to? No. And that's the point that I'm coming on to here. So if a person's fully armoured, head to foot, full plate harness, does the arrow need to go through a breastplate to wound them? No. Okay? For two very, very simple reasons. First of all, gaps. Secondly, thinner plates. Okay, there is a third issue where we talk about plate quality, but that's a very complicated one, and a lot of people have made this point. A lot of people have pointed out that in Todd's test, Kevin Legg's breastplate was about 0.5% carbon, so it's a medium high carbon. It wasn't hardened, but people have pointed out quite legitimately that breastplates can be hardened carbon steel in some cases, and we know at certain of the later battles in the 100 Years' War that the French used cuirasses that were and in fact even horse armour that was very effective at stopping arrows, and the Lombard cavalry, the Italian cavalry, and they probably had slightly better access to hardened carbon steel armour, better quality armour basically, because that's where a lot of armour is being made at this point. They were more or less invulnerable to English archery. So yes, absolutely, if you've got the best armour, it will make you quite invulnerable to archery, even the most powerful warbow. And we have to mention as well that we know that breastplates specifically were tested by crossbows. We know this from written sources, we know this from art or pictorial sources, where we see breastplates being tested, and this is the earliest form of bulletproof. And we know later on in the 16th and 17th centuries, breastplates were regularly tested with a pistol, and that's where the dent from the pistol ball, sometimes even a musket ball. In fact, in the 19th century, they were tested with musket balls. The dent from that is the proof stamp, and that's where we get the expression bulletproof. So they were bulletproof, they were crossbow proof, they were longbow proof. It's easy to make a breastplate. It will be heavy, perhaps, but it's easy to make a breastplate that is missile weapon proof. Or hand weapon proof. It's not a problem. But you cannot wear on the rest of your body armour that is equivalent to that breastplate. Quite simply, you can't be contained inside a giant steel sphere. Okay, it's not possible. You have to function, you have to be able to move, you have to be able to fight, you have to be able to get weapons out and do things, you have to be able to walk and run and climb. You need to be able to do the things that a soldier needs to be able to do. So quite simply, you have articulations in your armour. You all know that, okay? So the breastplate, regardless of whether an arrow or a bullet can go through a breastplate, there are places where an arrow will get in. There are gaps. Okay. Now, I've already talked about the lesser armoured people who have lots of gaps. My gaps are my entire arms, my legs, my face, my neck, in terms of missile weapons. So I'm in real trouble. My torso's protected, so, you know, I might survive to live the tale. I might get an arrow through the leg and think, that's it, I can't fight, I'm going to the back. I'm out, and tag out. If you are fully encased in plate armour of the 14th, 15th century, and you get an arrow that comes into the inside crook of the elbow, or comes in behind a gauntlet, or comes up underneath whatever neck defence you've got, an aventail or whatever, or goes through an aventail, or it comes in maybe at the armpit or the back of the knee, those are gaps. What have you got in the gaps? You've got mail, you've got an arming doublet. Basically, an arrow is going to stand a fairly good chance of getting through mail and arming doublet. As we saw in Todd's own test, when it slid off the bottom or just nicked the bottom of the breastplate, the arrow went straight through the mail and gambeson, no problem at all. Okay, that's going to be, if not a killing wound, it's going to be an incapacitating or debilitating wound that will probably, or stand a good chance of putting you out of fighting action. Okay. The second point is thinner plates. Okay, so I've spoken about plate quality. Armour at this period could be anything from the equivalent of wrought iron through mild steel, medium carbon steel, up to high carbon steel, up to hardened high carbon steel. So a huge variation in the metal quality. But just talking about metal thickness, we know that breastplates could be maybe, 3 millimeters thick at the front, but they might only be 0.8 of a millimeter thick at the sides, or 1 millimeter thick at the sides. Many plates that were on the limbs or articulations would be less than a millimeter thick, and they might also be the equivalent of mild steel, or even kind of medium carbon steel unhardened. When you get plates more thin like that, and when you get gaps together, the headline is that armour, fully armoured, you could have the best breastplate in the world, but the other areas on your armour could still be compromised. If we go, in fact, even in this period, very occasionally, but if we go into the 16th century to Henry VIII armour, we see that sometimes they even went to the effort of having plate articulations on the inside of joints, such that there was no mail exposed. And these were, sometimes tournament armours, sometimes field armours, but they were going to enormous lengths to try and fill those holes. Why? Because weapons have a way of finding holes, don't they? Everyone knows if you put anyone who does HEMA sparring, you put some protective equipment on, you get the best gloves, you get the best leg guards, you get the best jacket. Whatever you put on, the weapon, be it a plastic weapon or a blunt steel weapon, it will find a way of finding a gap. And it's no different when we're talking about sharp weapons or when we're talking about missile weapons like arrows here. So to conclude, basically, this was an amazing test. It was, I think, the conclusive test on can breastplates of this period be penetrated by arrows and bows of this period, and we kind of already knew the answer. The answer is no. We know that breastplates were proofed against crossbows, and we know that they were proofed later against guns as well. But the point is, it's kind of irrelevant. You don't need to penetrate a breastplate in order for massed, very powerful archery with hardened tips to be effective. First of all, most people aren't wearing full armour. Secondly, you nullify enemy cavalry. And thirdly, or we could say thirdly and fourthly, full armour has gaps, and we know that it has thinner plates that can be compromised. I hope this has been a useful thing. If you haven't watched Todd's video yet, please go and watch it. There'll be a link below. And it is so worth watching. It is conclusive for its type, but it is not a test of archery versus armour. And it doesn't give us any conclusion. It's not a black and white issue. It's a complicated issue. And a breastplate is only one, and it is the most hardcore piece of a 15th or 14th century armour. Thanks for watching. Give us a thumbs up if you thought this was interesting and useful. I'll see you really again soon for another video, and hopefully I'll be doing some more stuff with Todd myself soon. Hope to see you soon. Take care. Cheers. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.